Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
Exceptionally well, Rory. Very grateful to be here. How are you today?
Do you know, I'm all right. And that's all you can ask for. That's all you can ask for, really, isn't it? I'm all right.
It's good. And I hope that you listening to this, that you're all right as well. You've tuned in to episode 153 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. We are grateful to be here with you. And today we're going to be covering three topics. We're going to be starting off by speaking about attribution bias or attribution error. And then we're going to check in with our good friends at CPCAB. Rory, you met up just recently, very recently actually, with Heather Price to speak about the assessment protocols. At the time of this recording, we're in the midst of COVID. Things have changed, the world have changed, and there's been a bit of an update and a change from CPCAB.
Well, that's exactly it, Ken. And Heather is going to outline how assessment is going to be taking place, certainly this year at the date of recording. And I'm sure that those people who are doing CPCAB courses will be happy to hear the quite detailed information that Heather imparts.
Looking forward to that one. And then we end episode 153 by something that I think is going to be really useful for our qualified practitioner friends and for students alike, and that is preparing to work with anger. And that's certainly something that I've experienced in my counselling room, so I look forward to us getting to that topic. But let's kick off episode 153 by looking at that attribution bias or error.
Yes, well, first of all, it's not often that we bring psychological theories into a counselling podcast. And the reason I chose it, and I'll be quite honest, with the world as it is and the discussions around racial prejudice and just the difficulties the world finds itself in at the moment, I thought it would be useful to have a look at some of the reasons. Now, these aren't excuses, don't misunderstand me. But some of the psychological reasons that maybe people make the wrong choices. And I'm not talking about extreme violence here. And what I'm talking about is what psychologists think of how we think when we meet people. And it's been long known in psychological circles about attribution bias and attribution error. And basically, we as human beings have a kind of predisposition to have what's called dispositional attribution. And dispositional attribution is we tend to think that things that people do, say for instance, if someone's late for something all the time, that it's actually a character flaw. And interestingly enough, we will look for evidence of that. Once we believe that someone's got a kind of character flaw or something's within their character, you know, either they turn up late or maybe they're not done the work, so they could be thinking of being lazy or 100 other reasons. Then, psychologically, we look for evidence to reinforce our beliefs, Ken.
Yeah, I guess it goes back to we see the world not as it is, but as we are. And that's that quote is attributed to Anis Nin. And it's, you know, you started off by saying that this is a psychological theory, and we don't often discuss that. But I think that it does form part of counselling and psychotherapy at its very base, because we're called on to explore self as counsellors, as psychotherapists. And these biases are unseen to us. And we act out on them because we're kind of biologically wired in a way to act on biases and attribution, looking at others and kind of nodding our head and saying, well, of course they're doing that. It's because of this and this and this. And you've kind of outlined that. And then the alternative to that is that the self-serving bias, which is kind of the opposite end of that, where we're kind of looking at, I'm doing this and this and this because, and you know, it's all good and well, and we overinflate the importance and the reasons and our own abilities when it comes to self, but kind of diminish that when we look outside of self.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that it is a human condition, but the research points it's more predominant in individualistic societies. Collective societies, it would seem don't have as much attribution bias. And when I'm talking about individualistic and collective, we live in the West in an individual society where the message is, you have to take personal responsibility and you have to own everything you do. Whereas in collective cultures, there's a sense of a more societal ownership of ideas and ways of behaving. And it seems to be more prevalent in individual cultures. And what I did is I thought to myself, I'll write a case study, a short case study on how it may impact on a client-counsellor relationship, and I will release that as a free download that's connected to this podcast, and people can have a listen. And one of the things in supervision, both Ken and myself are supervisors. One of the things we taught about is when we're working with supervisees is to look at what's called the seventh eye in a seven-eyed model. It's the Showart and Hawkins model of supervision, and there's 5 positions that you can take as 7 positions you can take as a supervisor, and one of those is the wider situational arena that the client finds themselves in. And I don't know about you, Ken, but I found myself saying to supervisees when I'm hearing, well, they're turning up late or they don't seem to be really engaging, I often reflect and say, I wonder what's happening in the wider area of this client's life, what's going on around them. And of course, what I'm trying to get to is something that we call situational attribution. In other words, not kind of looking at the client and saying, well, it might be something to do with their character, but is there forces, societal forces, or maybe something domestically out in their home or at work that is causing them to be how they are? And that's sometimes called situational or external attribution. And I really do think that it's a really useful little bit of a theory to have in your pocket, attribution, because we all do it. I know I do it. I'll own it. We all do it. It's just a case of having the awareness to say, actually, I think I'm just attributing that. And now I'm looking for evidence to reinforce my belief, and my belief may be wrong.
Yeah. And if you're looking for an example of where you may have seen this in your own life, because as you've said there, Rory, we all act in some way from that place. Think about the last time that somebody took your parking spot or cut you off when you were driving or did something like that. It's interesting how we immediately go to, oh, they're driving recklessly or they're selfish, and we immediately go to the character as opposed to the situation. They maybe didn't see us. They were maybe just changing lanes and we were in their blind spot of their mirror. And it is interesting, we're called on in our journey to become counselors, psychotherapists, to really examine ourselves and specifically the unseen parts. The seen parts are easy because we can see what they are and we can go, oh yeah, I don't like it when I do that, and we can then plan and work on that. But it's these unseens that are so valuable. When we do dip into them, there's a rich seam of personal and professional growth that lies there. And Rory mentioned his super duper handout, that case study, and you can get that. It's free of charge. It's our gift, and you can get that by going to our website. It is counsellingtutor.com, and right at the top you'll find our little menu bar. Click on the podcasts tab, and that's going to bring up all of the past podcasts. And the episode you're looking for is today's episode, which is 153. Right there on that page, you're going to be able to download Rory's, what I like to call super duper handouts, because that's the kind of feedback we get from your handouts, Rory. They're so valuable. They're great for printing out, popping in a file, a reference file that you can kind of go through whenever you need them, or keep them digitally as well. And you've got that information for when you want to go through that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that having an understanding of attribution error or bias, as it's sometimes referred to, is something that we should all know about, because it seems to be part of the human condition, and one that I think seems to get people into trouble from time to time. This kind of natural kind of disposition to look at people's characters as opposed to thinking a bit wider and saying, well, what's happening in their wider environment. And if we all did that, if we all had a bit more kind of, I don't know, a little bit more thought, a little bit more situational attribution thinking, I think the world would be a bit of a kinder place, to be honest.
I think I'm definitely standing with you on that one. Maybe that's my bias, Rory. Maybe that's the self-serving bias that this is a great podcast and that's a great idea. And you see, these are the questions that come up when you start examining it. And that's what we're about here at Counselling Tutor. It's about looking at your competence, because if you don't know about this, then it just remains unseen. But just from you taking the time to kind of listen to this podcast, what you're doing is you're sharpening your competence. You're sharpening your competence. You're adding more arrows to that quiver, as it were, and we can use that in service of our own growth and development. But of course, at the end of the day, in service of our clients.
Absolutely. And here's my challenge: once you've listened to this episode of the podcast, or at least this segment, now go out into the world and watch how other people kind of use dispositional attribution. Hear the conversations, hear people saying, well, he would do that because that's the kind of person he, she, they are. And have a listen to that, and you'll find that now we've mentioned it, it'll become more evident than ever. It'll just stand out like a shiny light in a dark room.
Like it. Well, thank you. That's a great topic. And we're now kind of going into our check-in with CPCAB, speaking with Heather Price. At the time of recording, which is kind of June of 2020, COVID is still very prevalent, and it's difficult for students. They've been removed from their courses, they're distanced from their courses, and it's about assessment protocols, Rory.
It is, and I have to say, I felt a little bit, I'm not sorry, well, yes, sorry, I use the word sorry for awarding bodies, because they've come in for a lot of criticism, not just awarding bodies, but universities, because students really didn't know how they were going to finish their courses, and certainly that was amplified on our Facebook page. And if you're not a member of our Facebook page, just type in Counselling Tutor into Facebook, find our page. It's a closed group, but if you knock on the door, we'll let you in, and you'll be with thousands of like-minded people. They're students of counselling, there's qualified practitioners, supervisors and tutors, and we all chat about the world of counselling and psychotherapy. And this was a topic that was brought up. What am I going to do? How am I going to get my exams completed? And a lot of people kind of projected anger at the awarding bodies. And as Heather outlines, the awarding bodies, CPCAB and other awarding bodies, have had to take advice from the regulator, Ofqual, certainly the regulator here in England, before they could make any moves, which is why they couldn't give out any information until it was approved by Ofqual. And Heather outlines not only the background to it, but also how they are accommodating students to be able to take their qualification and hopefully pass it.
So let's check in with CPCAB.
Check in with CPCAB.
And we welcome back Heather Price from CPCAB. So welcome, Heather.
Morning.
Morning, yes, because we are recording this in the morning.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. And
Yeah.
and in podcast 150, we talked with your colleague Kelly about preparing for exams, and that seems a world away now because, of course, the COVID-19 epidemic has forced colleges and training providers to close, and that has brought assessment into focus. How are people's portfolios, our work being assessed? And you're here to talk about how CPCAB has adapted to the new kind of socially distanced world and the measures you've put in to help people achieve, which may be slightly different from how that's been done in the past.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, I mean, certainly the world has changed so much since I recorded my last podcast, whenever that was. And CPCAB have been working very hard behind the scenes to comply with what Ofqual want us to do. And we have to do that, otherwise the validity of our regulated qualifications won't stand. So we can't tinker about with things perhaps in the way we might want to if it doesn't fit with what Ofqual want us to do. And I guess that's the first thing that students and tutors have been asking, what's taking you so long? Well, it has taken quite a long time, and Ofqual actually only issued their final version of their extraordinary framework, I think about 2 weeks ago, and we'd got stuff ready to go and published almost straight away. So the different ways that we've had to look at our different levels, I'm not going to talk too much about the level 2s and 3s, just to say that we've had to do what's called a calculated result for the level 2s and 3s, as they can't sit their normal exam looking at their a video and writing a paper on it. So there is no exam at all. Exams for levels 2 and 3 have been cancelled for this summer. So tutors are preparing calculated results on what they already know of their students and the evidence that had been collected either just before the lockdown or up until now. And so that's happening at the moment. Tutors are doing this in their centres, in their colleges, and students don't need to have any particular involvement in that at all. So all of that information is on our website. It's called mitigation. So if the normal assessment can't take place, then it's been mitigated in certain ways. And the mitigation for level 2 and 3 is calculation. That's what Ofqual want us to call it. At level 4, it is a little bit different, and I'll say a little bit more about that at the moment. Levels 5 and 6, we haven't had to do any mitigation because they write a case review that they do at home on their own, not under exam conditions. So they can continue to do that and send it in to us in the usual way. So it's level 4 which caused us to have to think very carefully about what we could do. Proficiency at level 4 gives license to practice. So we needed to be very careful about how the external assessment went some way towards measuring that proficiency. And previously doing a half-hour recording and a written 2-hour paper was a very good measure of that, alongside their internal portfolio and obviously client work and all that goes with that. So we decided that we would do the same or something very similar as the level 5s and 6s, and it would be a written case review that students can do at home in their own time in an open book way.
Ofqual are the organisation in England who oversee qualifications, and they regulate awarding bodies like yourself, their qualifications. Yep. And I guess so that employers would know that if someone's done a qualification in Cardiff in the UK and someone's done a qualification in London, that the levelness and the academic rigour will be the same. And from what I'm hearing is it took until the middle of May 2020 before they decided what you could do. You have to act on what they're asking you or they're telling you to do. So the reason for the delay was because they hadn't decided how it was going to be, and you as an awarding body can only act. In that.
I mean, they did a certain amount of fact finding where we had to fill in documents to say how many students at each level would be affected, how that might affect them, what we could do instead. And they were gathering that sort of information from all the different awarding bodies, not just to do with counselling, but all different awarding bodies with loads of different subjects all across the country, and then having to decide what was going to be acceptable for each level. And they concentrated on the GCSEs and A levels first, and then they got round to the vocational and technical qualifications after that, which is why it took a little bit longer than GCSEs and A levels.
Yes, and there has been some criticism about awarding bodies dragging the feet and not giving information, but that's really unwarranted because you can only act when you have got authorization from the people who regulate the qualification. You can't do this arbitrarily. You have to wait. So I think that clears that misconception up. And obviously, instead of doing an exam, it's now called an open book exam. Can you just explain what I know what it means, but can you explain what an open book exam is? Or just briefly kind of give us a vision of what that might look like.
Yeah, well, it's we call it a case review, and we've given specific guidelines which are on the website as to how it should be written. And in line with all of our qualifications, we'd like it to be written, well, we want it to be written under the 7 headings, the 7 processes that run through CPCAB's qualifications at all levels. So there are 7 headings, and each of the 7 headings has a number of criteria, 1, 2, or 3, that need to be addressed. And it says very clearly, you must, which means the students must do whatever it says in order to get the mark. That is very clear.
Yes.
The overall length is a maximum of 3,500 words. So that's approximately 500 words each section. And one of the questions students often ask is, well, can I go over the word count? Can I go over 500 for one section? Well, yeah, you can, but then you have to bear in mind it's going to leave you short in another section. Yes. So each section is worth 3 marks. So that's 3 sevens, which is 21. Students have to get 11 marks to pass, with at least 1 mark per section, per 7 sections. So if they only get half a mark or 0, they won't pass the whole thing anyway, even if they've got 3 marks for most of the other sections.
Sure. I think that clears up what an open book exam is. It's an exam in any other name, but it's not sat in exam conditions. You're examining the knowledge of the candidate or the student, but it's not under invigilated conditions. They can do this at home in their own time.
Yeah, and they can look at books, they can look at notes if they want to, if that's helpful. I mean, mainly what we're looking at is the experience that they've had with their client, and to document that and reflect on what worked, what maybe didn't work particularly well, what they might have done differently, what theory did they draw on, what did they take to supervision, how has their own personal development influenced how they work with a client. So it's a snapshot of work with one client. We've suggested over about 6 sessions, but that's not inflexible. If they've only done 4 or 5 sessions with a client, but they think they've got enough material to address all 7 areas, well, then that's fine. We've had questions as to whether they can use a case study that they might have done in class, and we're saying yes, they can, as long as it's not been written under these 7 headings, which most cases it's not, and not been assessed under those 7 headings by a tutor.
Well, I think you made that really, really clear, and I think it's just so helpful, the transparency and the fact that these questions are must questions. You have to answer them. A must verb is you do have to answer them. Now, you mentioned questions, and I'm sure that there'll be a lot of students listening to this who have questions. Who do they address these questions to?
Well, in the first instance, they should go back to their tutor, because the tutors are the ones that usually liaise with us. I mean, students can write in, but probably several people in their group would have the same question. So it's easier really if they go through their tutor. If the tutor doesn't know the answer or can't find it on the website, then they, of course, can ring in or email us.
So one final question, Heather, with this new assessment method is, what's the involvement of the tutor?
Yes, I'm glad you asked me that, Rory. The tutor doesn't have too much input at all, and the tutor has to remember that it is an exam. So their involvement is limited to the students writing the case review at home, then signing the cover sheet. There's a cover sheet that goes with it, and they will have that. The student puts their name on it at the top and they sign it in box 1. And we've had queries about, can it be an electronic signature? How do we do an electronic signature? We can't do an electronic signature. Electronic signature is fine if they can do it. If not, they can type it. But they have to put their name at the top where it says name, and then type where it says signature if they can't put an electronic signature. That goes back to the tutor. The tutor's only role is to just scan through, make sure all the pages are there, that there are 7 sections, that the word count is there. Name and candidate number is on the bottom of each page. And then the tutor countersigns the cover sheet. And then when they've got the whole group, they send it to us. So the tutor is not allowed to read it through and give any feedback or any assessment because it is an exam.
I think that is really useful. And I think the whole topic has been a really useful topic because it's cleared up, certainly not a small amount of anxiety that students, certainly around in the level 4, have had, but also gives a clear way forward. And I will say, these are extraordinary circumstances. I have, in my long life, 62 recently, I've never come across circumstances like this.
No.
And awarding bodies, the people who regulate qualifications, they're working in a completely new sphere as well.
Yeah.
So, Heather, thank you so much for joining us.
Check-in with CPCAB is proudly sponsored by CPCAB, the only awarding body run by counsellors for counsellors. To learn more about CPCAB qualifications and to get more detailed information on today's podcast topic, visit cpcab.co.uk.
Well, that's cleared that up, hasn't it? And I think there's no doubt at all, anybody who's listened to that will know, certainly if you're a CPCAB student, exactly what's going to happen, exactly how the new assessment's going to take place, and crucially, what your tutor can and cannot do. The long and short of it is that, as Heather said, your tutor cannot mark these external pieces of work. They have to be done by you and sent off. So I think that takes the pressure off tutors a bit, but we're eternally grateful for our good friends at CPCAB to clear that up, because I think it was something that was causing a lot of anxiety.
Indeed. So kind of wandering into the area that we call practice matters, and it's where we look at what might present within our practice relationship. If you're a student, these topics are really important kind of building blocks for when you go into practice, or if you're in a placement practice. But our qualified practitioners out there, maybe you'll be able to relate to today's, and it's working with anger.
Yes. There's only really 2 presentations that give people some difficulty. In my experience of training counsellors, and I'm sure you'll confer on this, Ken. You ask students, what their fears. Indeed, you can ask qualified practitioners the same question, and usually you get the response that people will be very worried about people who are sex offenders and people who are angry. And I think that both of those need exploring, because angry people and sex offenders need counselling. It might not be for everybody to counsel them, but they're human beings and they may need counselling. And in fact, it might help with their behaviour, angry behaviour and sex offending behaviour, if they got some counselling. But it is a bit of a worry, and traditionally, anger would have been dealt with by anger management, and it certainly does have a place. But I've delivered a lecture on kind of looking at anger in a slightly different way and thinking about how we can work therapeutically with anger and, crucially, contract with angry clients, and looking around all the kind of peripheral areas of anger. So I think it's quite a thorough lecture, and I think it's one that'd be quite useful. It's one I used to deliver to my students, and they found it incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I think anger for me, well, first of all, when we look at anger, what we need to understand is that anger is one of our base emotions. And what I mean by a base emotion is if you look at a little baby that's just been born, you're going to see the base emotions, the emotions that we're born with. There'll be giggling and happiness, but there will also be frustration and anger, the reddening of the face. And you can relate to this if you've had children, and they call it the terrible twos for a very good reason. The tantrums that you might get. It is an emotion that is in all of us. And as counsellors, as psychotherapists, we welcome all emotions, or we I guess aim to welcome all emotions into our therapy room, because the society is kind of developed in such a way that it's very selective of which emotions are appropriate. If you're happy and joyous and bubbly, we want to see that. Bring on more of that. But if you're depressed or sad or angry, that needs to be hidden away, and that is not appropriate. But it is appropriate because anger is a real emotion. I certainly have experienced it, and maybe if you're listening to this, you can look and say, yeah, all right, I can recognize that within myself. But very often it is suppressed. So I think the first stage of working with anger is to maybe examine what your relationship is with anger, both for yourself, but also what comes up within self when anger is shown by somebody else. Where do you go to? What are the feelings inside you when somebody else is angry, or when there is conflict? Is it something to run away from? Is it something that you feel comfortable and peaceful with? And I think that's a great starting point for thinking about working with anger, and it's a good idea to think about that before you experience the anger in the therapy room, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And I think anger gets a bad press. It's a bit like selfish. I think selfish gets a bad press. I think anger gets a bad press. You know, anger itself is a kind of an emotion that sometimes we always think on the violent side of things, but anger has changed the world. Plenty of angry people that have changed the world. And in the lecture, I quote, I talk about Rosa Parks and the Alabama bus boycott, and how that was the spark, or one of the sparks, for the American civil rights movement. So don't underestimate anger as an agent of change. I think people conflate anger and violence. And I think that it's very, very easy for a therapist who's had violence driven from anger to be really frightened of angry clients. And here's the thing, if you want to stop counselling someone because you feel you can't handle their anger, is it ethical to tell them a white lie and refer them on? And I'm going to explain this and kind of tease this out in the lecture, because the literature I was reading gave very interesting ideas on what you may want to do if you need to refer a client on, and what you may need to say to a client, or kind of how you may frame it if you have to do that. Very interesting ethical issues as well, an ethical perspective to that. But I think it's a rather big topic, because it comes up time and time again. And I know from my experience, it's one of the things that therapists don't like working with, anger.
100%, and yet something we need to understand and understand what we might do if it does show itself. And I guess, I mean, you've mentioned the lecture, the recent lecture that you've done on this, Rory, and I just want to mention, if you want to engage in Rory's lectures and our other lectures, just go to counsellingtutor.com. That is our mother website. Right there on the home page, you can select, if you're a student, select our student resources. If you're a qualified practitioner, click on our CPD provision, and we have a library of lectures, so all the information is there if you're interested in that. But going back to what you said, Rory, anger, it starts with the contracting, and you mentioned this just a little while back, in that if we are I guess working with somebody that may struggle with anger, because there is a reality that there are certain people that really struggle with anger, and it tends to be really destructive within their lives, and they may well reach out for help just on that very topic, because it can be devastating. It's kind of a build-up, and then the anger becomes explosive, and then they're left with the consequences of how that played out in their lives. It's almost like feeling remorse for how they played out, and I will never do that again, and I'm going to really try hard this time. And then they find that they're triggered again and go through that same cycle again and again and again. And if that is a presentation within therapy and you feel comfortable to work with that, it's about starting with the contract of how you might work if that anger shows itself within the therapy room, and it is rather explosive, because you want to be welcoming it in. You don't want to be saying, well, here we go, we're going to sit here and calmly speak about your anger, but it's not allowed in this room. You want to welcome it into the room, but you also want to look to your safety as a practitioner, the safety of your client. Anger can cause fists through doors. It can cause self-harm. It can cause damage to property within your therapy room. So you want to be kind of contracting around, your anger is welcome here. However, and then you would put in the boundaries around that, I guess.
Yes, it's about a robust assessment as well. I mean, we cover that in the lecture. But yes, you're absolutely right, Ken. We should be welcoming every emotion in, even the ones that we're uncomfortable with. And I think just thinking about, anger, sometimes I think it comes back to our first topic, that, we can think that people are angry because it's in their character. He's just a very angry person. How often have you heard that? He's an angry man. He's just naturally angry. Dispositional attribution, where it may be something about someone's situation. And I'm going to outline the difference between rage and anger, and what rage is and how it leads to anger. And I think that when I've finished the lecture, I'm hoping that people will have a really good outline and a really good understanding of what drives anger and how we can work with it therapeutically, and how we can engage with that configuration, that emotion, in the service of the client. Indeed.
You want to catch that lecture, counsellingtutor.com. All the information is there. Again, it's about sharpening the competence. We're back there again to sharpening that competence. And what I recognize within self with regard to anger, I recognize that there are times when I am angry, and I have to. I'm not going to hide away from that. That is who I am. I am human, and I experience anger from time to time. And what I recognize in that, having kind of post being angry, being able to look at that and kind of reflect on it, is how quickly that emotion can escalate. It's really, really interesting that it can start off as a little bit of irritation, and then you're starting to get a little, the teeth are clenching, and it's almost a holding back. And I can go, let me speak for self as opposed to you. I can go from 0 to pretty high on that anger scale in a very short period of time. It's a very quick escalation.
Yeah. And yes, and that is to do with how we cognitively manage that. And I'll be talking about something called the ASDA way of managing it. And also I'll be giving some interesting facts on anger. Did some research into anger, came across a really interesting piece of research, and I spent a good hour going, really? That many people? And that often? And I'll give you one piece of information from that research. It's a few years old because it was a big body of research. We are apparently the most angry. England is the most angry nation in the whole of Europe.
Wow!
Statistically, so make of that what you want. But it's really important, and I think it comes down to our good friend Terence, the philosopher, who said, I am human, nothing human is alien to me. And I think it's a really good kind of benchmark for how we consider ourselves as therapists. We should realize that it's within us to be angry. And also, when a client comes with anger, it shouldn't be alien to us. We should realise it's part of the human condition and be able safely, and there's the key phrase there, to be able to engage with that and to help clients, because it can't be great to be angry all the time. It can't be great to live your life like that. And there's usually quite good reasons why people are angry. If you work and peel the onion away, you find actually that there's very good reasons why people are angry. All behaviour is directed at a goal, as Roger said. And if we can find what that is, then we've got a real chance to help people and for people to help themselves.
Well, there it is. As you were mentioning that statistic on England, I could feel my self-serving bias start to kick in to want to justify, and my attribution bias. Had you said it was a different country, my attribution bias would have kicked in. What an episode. What an episode.
Yes, well, we started off with a little bit of psychological theory from our colleagues in the psychological world, attribution bias or attribution error. Then we spoke to our friends at CPCAB and talked about different ways of assessing courses during this very difficult period of our history in the COVID crisis. And we finished off with not looking back in anger, just to steal the lyrics of a well-known Manchester songwriter. But we mustn't look back in anger, I hear you say. Stay grounded and definitely stay safe.
If you're a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist, then why not check out the Counsellor CPD Library? Stay current with your CPD requirements with over 150 hours of academically rigorous, on-demand lectures you can stream to your device. Joining Counselor CPD will expand your skill set to create a more specialised, highly rewarding practice. For more information on the Counselor CPD Library, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.